can go to the next. Thank you, Marlon. You can go to the next slide, please. Wopida. Hello, everyone. My name is Gwendolyn Packard. I'm a Hunktawan Dakota and a survivor. I work with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. NIWRC was founded in 2010, and in FY11 we became the National Indian Resource Center, funded by the Family Violence Prevention Services Administration. This year, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. NIWRC is dedicated to reclaiming the sovereignty and safety of Native women. NIWRC works with tribal nations, Alaska Native villages, Native Hawaiians, and Indian communities to strengthen their capacity to respond to domestic violence and enhance safety for Native women and children. Our mission is to provide national leadership to end violence against Native women by supporting culturally grounded grassroots advocacy. Carol?
Next slide. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Warsham, the director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. We're a sister resource center to NIWRC, and we're one of the special issue resource centers funded by the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, or funded by the Act, but supported by the program. And we've been a national center since 2005, but we were doing work locally in Chicago on the intersection of trauma, mental health, substance use, and DV since 1999. And we're located in Chicago. And our mission is to promote survivor-defined healing, liberation, and equity by transforming the systems that impact survivors of domestic and sexual violence and their families. And our vision is for a society where all people are free of systemic, collective, and individual trauma. So part of our work is to develop and promote what we call accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed responses to domestic violence, and to support the entire domestic violence field in doing this and creating trauma-informed, culturally responsive organizations and services, and to better serving survivors and their families with mental health and substance use related needs, but also to support the mental health and substance use disorder treatment systems in addressing and responding to survivors who experience domestic violence and other lifetime trauma. And Gwen and I have partnered for many years on all of these intersecting issues. It's great joy to be working together and also be thinking about the implications for both the civil and criminal legal system and the child welfare system in terms of how all of these issues impact survivors when they become involved with those systems. Next slide. And this is just a disclaimer. We each have one saying that what we're saying isn't necessarily a reflection of our federal funders. Next slide, please. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Warsham and I, as she mentioned, have been working together for many, many years. I think as soon as I started working with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, I had the good fortune to meet Carol, and we clicked immediately because we both had, we both shared a lot of passion and commitment to addressing not only intimate partner violence, but its connections to mental health and substance use as well. It was both something that we had both dealt with. I ran a domestic violence program for a number of years, and it was just, very rarely is it ever just domestic violence. It's always these connections are there, and we need to address them and work with them in a meaningful way. So we've been working together over the years, identifying, addressing, and creating effective trauma-informed, relative or survivor-centered, and culturally appropriate strategies on the intersections of domestic violence with substance use and mental health. We know that domestic violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. And with this presentation today, we are expanding our reach to address substance use coercion in the context of intimate partner violence and implications for tribal courts. The objectives for this workshop are to understand the different and common forms of mental health and substance use coercion, which is the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force and threats, which is something we see quite common in intimate partner relationships where there's domestic violence. We will also be looking at the impact of mental health and substance use coercion on survivors of intimate partner violence and their children. And as we know, children are often most affected by the domestic violence and the coercive actions. We'll also look at the implications for mental health and substance use coercion for tribal court professionals. And throughout this presentation, please put any questions you may have in the chat or question section on your screen. So next slide, please. So let's begin by addressing trauma, mental health, substance use, and mental health and intimate partner violence. Next slide, please. Intimate partner violence has significant health, mental health, and substance use related effects. And I say all these things together to kind of look at the connections and to kind of expand our thinking outward about this. There are high rates of intimate partner violence and other trauma among people accessing substance use disorder treatment. There's people who abuse their partners actively and use substance use issues against their partners as a tactic of control. We also see intimate partner violence, how it impacts survivors' ability to access and engage in substance use disorder. And these are all things we're going to be talking about more as we get into our presentation. And substance use is a major cause of child removal. It's one of the third leading causes for child removal. Integrated approaches to intimate partner violence, trauma, and substance use are critical to the safety and recovery of survivors and their children. Next slide, please. So domestic violence is defined as a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors designed to dominate and control a partner through fear and intimidation. This is a definition we've been hearing for many, many years. There's certainly a lot of other definitions out there, but this is the one that we use in the context of our presentation. People who perpetrate domestic violence use a combination of coercive tactics that include physical assault, sexual violation, psychological abuse, economic control, social isolation, stalking, deprivation, intimidation, and threats, including threats and coercion related to deportation, custody, reproduction, disability, HIV status, sexual orientation, gender identity, substance use, mental health, housing, economic stability, and access to services. These behaviors result in physical and psychological harm. And so you see the connections, we just keep expanding this out further and further. Next slide, please. Lifetime intimate partner violence, rape, stalking, and physical victimization. It affects 35.6% of women and 28.5% of men. And rates are higher among people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And you can see the data there, 43% of lesbian women, 61% of bisexual women, 26% of gay men, 37% of bisexual men, and 25 to 54 trans individuals. And rates are highest among American Indian and Alaska Native communities. There are more than 4 in 5 American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. And in some communities, that's actually 5 in 5. Violence against Indian women is rooted in colonization And Indian women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than the national average. Homicide is the third leading cause of death for Native women. 75% of Indian women murdered were killed by an intimate partner. And as Indian women, we live our lives in the dangerous intersection of gender and race. American Indian and Alaska Native women who are victims of domestic violence, of all of them, 38% were unable to access services. So it's not surprising that we are the most victimized group of people in this country because we have the least amount of resources, and access to services is difficult and oftentimes unavailable or non-existent. We all know that these numbers are low based on reports of domestic violence and do not necessarily reflect the entire scope of the problem. We know that many incidents of domestic violence go unreported. And either way, these rates are still unacceptably high. And although women are more likely to experience multiple forms of intimate partner violence and to be more severely affected, we know that men are victims of domestic violence too, and that Native men experience disproportionately high rates of sexual and physical violence by an intimate partner as well. Next slide, please. So we know that intimate partner violence has significant mental health and substance use effects. And in women, it manifests as increased PTSD, depression, suicidality, chronic pain, insomnia, and substance or opioid use, and high rates of intimate partner violence among women in treatment. For LGBTQ individuals, we see higher rates of depression and substance use among gay men, and increased substance use associated with gender abuse of transgender women. And the chart on the side just shows you, some of the percentages of victimization by an intimate partner and the risk for depression, PTSD, substance use, and suicidality. PTSD 3 times, suicide attempts 4 times, and substance use disorder 6 times. Next slide, please. Intimate partner violence is prevalent among people accessing mental health and substance use disorder treatment. And I want to, give Carol an opportunity too, if I skimmed over something or missed something, to please wave at me or something. and I'll okay, all right, thank you. So we see higher rates of domestic violence among women accessing substance use disorder treatment. And the percentages are really high. I mean, 47 to 90% report DV in their lifetime, and 31 to 67% reported DV in the past year. We also see high rates of domestic violence among women accessing mental health treatment. On an average, 30% of women in outpatient settings and 33% of women in inpatient settings, and 30 to 60% of women in psychiatric ER settings report victimization by an intimate partner. Next slide, please.
Before you do that, I just wanted to say that one of the things that we hear from people working in the substance use field and people with lived experience, that the majority of women in substance use disorder treatment have experienced intimate partner violence and substance use coercion, which we'll talk about more in a moment, just to hold that. I mean, the research, there's such a range because everyone uses very different methodology and different definitions, but we also know that there's a those intersections are very strong.
It's true. Thank you, Carol. So for this next part that was created, when I was looking at this and kind of looking at all the indicators and factors that kind of went into it, it kind of feels like a spiral in a sense to me. So you have the traumatic effects of abuse, which are health, clearly. Domestic violence affects the health of victims and survivors, along with mental health, and suicide is high among domestic violence victims and survivors, along with substance use. And then when you layer in some of the intergenerational, interpersonal, and economic factors into that equation, you can see that this person is really dealing with a lot of things are going on there. Under the ongoing coercive control, well, I don't know, I kind of like to start at the bottom. I don't know if, Carol, do you have a preference on how the wheel would go?
Oh, I usually start at the top and then go to the bottom because that's even
Yeah,
more compelling, but
yeah,
either way is fine. I
okay.
think people are used to thinking, it depends where you're starting from, what you're used to thinking about, but I think people think more narrowly and then expanding it out, but either way is fine.
Okay. So I'll just go to the bottom to look at some of the traumatic legacies of historical trauma, which we know is huge in so many of our communities. And then again, looking at that and the health and mental health of our people, our economies, our societies, the cultural and spiritual factors, environmental, and then the transgenerational. So again, I feel like when we move this way, we kind of build on that. And then when we look at ongoing coercive control that's taken place in domestic violence for for victim survivors of domestic violence, when we look at the ongoing coercive control, we see some of these things that are taking place, such as undermining the sanity and sobriety or gaslighting. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. Jeopardizing their health and well-being. And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. The healthcare community has had a really good response to domestic violence in terms of how they work with victim survivors that come in and separating them from their partner who could be their abusive partner, and really focusing on what's going on with them and their well-being. We know that perpetrators or batterers can control these access of resources to victim survivors. And I know a lot of us that go to IHS, you only get to miss 3 appointments, and then you're kind of kicked out of the system for a year, and it's hard to get back in. And so a lot of times when victim survivors are, when their partners set up, stop them or prevent them for going in for their checkups or to seeing a healthcare professional without calling in and canceling 24 hours in advance, then they don't get the help that they need, and they've really fallen off like another important area in their life. Ongoing structural violence, and here we see the policies that perpetrate structural violence and discrimination and the systems that all come into play. Did you want to add to that, Carol?
Yeah, one of the things that, when we originally started thinking about this, and there are many ways to think about all this, is that when people are doing work in a more service-oriented setting or clinical setting, they're thinking about the individual and not thinking about all the not only abusive partner, but all the systems that actually create trauma in the first place. And so there's always not just treating the symptoms, but transforming the condition. So it's a way of looking at that, and just thinking. And I know from Gwen, what you've taught me about tribal healing to wellness, of course, there's a lot more thinking about the community and what needs to happen to support people in ways that often traditional treatment courts don't. So, oh, sorry about that. So anyway, that's all.
Okay, thank you. The next slide, please. So mental health and substance use coercion include a range of abusive tactics designed to undermine a partner's sanity and sobriety. And that was something I'd mentioned earlier about the gaslighting, about, and there's a lot of good materials out there on how that technique is used and how effective it is too. In people thinking they're crazy when in fact someone's manipulating their environment, their emotions, their thinking, and everything else. Controlling a partner's access to treatment, and that could come right down to preventing them from leaving the house, or locking them up so they can't go out, or You know, for some, we had a woman tell us that he had hid her shoes, so she couldn't go anywhere. She certainly wasn't going to go meet with a doctor or a treatment, someone in a treatment program with barefoot. You know, you can't even go in places barefoot. So there's a lot of ways that partners can block access to treatment. They can also, you know, say it's not working. I don't think it's working. I think you need to try something else, you know, and you need to quit going there. I think you're getting worse, you know, and those kinds of hearing that over and over again, sabotaging a partner's recovery efforts, and discrediting a partner with potential sources of protection and support, and jeopardize custody. I mean, one of the big things that women who experience mental health or substance use issues and that are dealing with domestic violence, that they hear is that, you know, I'm gonna tell everybody you're crazy. You know, you've got a drinking problem, and you know, all these other things. And it's always, you know, can be used as a way to lose custody of your children, and that's certainly something we don't ever want to see happen. Exploit a partner's mental health or substance use for personal or financial gain, and again, it's putting someone down to elevate yourself in that relationship. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of ways that that manifests too. I don't know if Carol, if you wanted to comment on that as well.
The next slides will go into more detail on that.
Okay,
So
that's what I
fine.
thought. Okay,
Yeah.
all right, that's what I thought. Okay,
Yeah.
so now we're going to switch to Carol. So the next slide, please.
So thanks, Gwen. So one of the things about mental health and substance use coercion, these are coercive tactics that advocates and survivors have been talking about for forever. And we'd done partnered with the Office of the Assistant, United States DHHS Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, and our funders, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, to have a technical expert meeting, I think October 2019, on substance use coercion. And we did a lit review, and when we did the first search, we found nobody used the term substance use coercion, but it only came up in people being coerced into treatment by drug courts. That's where the only language we found. But we also found that there was a lot of mention of mental health and substance use coercion in qualitative studies without actually naming it as such. So this was the first large-scale quantitative study, in fact, the only one that we know of. And we did this in 2012 in partnership with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And sorry, I'm going to put my phone on silent. I have a family member who's ill, so I have been keeping it on. So sorry for the distraction. So the hotline would do what they call focus surveys at the end of a call if someone isn't in crisis and agrees to participate, usually because they want their experiences to help other people who may be having similar kinds of experiences. So the first one was the mental health coercions. Hold on. Sorry. I'm just trying to put my phone on silent. So this study was over 2,700 callers, and as you can see, 86% said that their partners had called them crazy at some time, or quote unquote crazy, or accused them of being crazy as a way to undermine them and make them feel really bad about themselves, and really diminish their own sense of well-being and confidence in themselves. But 74% actually of the callers said that they actually did think, their partners did things that deliberately made them feel like they were going crazy or losing their mind, like gaslighting. One story that I heard many years ago from a colleague who's now a friend in New York State, someone had admitted herself to a psychiatric unit because she was hearing voices, decided to stay longer and asked a friend to go to her home and pick up some clothes. And when her friend went there, it was very cold, so she turned up the thermostat. And when she did that, she could hear voices as well. And we now hear this with smart homes, that, doing things to raise the temperature and make loud noises and lock people out and all kinds of things. So it's just like one example, but there's so many ways that people do this, and just think about what it's like to live with someone who's constantly making you doubt yourself. And then of the 52% of callers who said they sought help, sought help at some point for being upset or depressed, almost half said their partner had tried to prevent or discourage them from getting help or taking meds that were prescribed. And then 50% also said their partners threatened to report them to authorities, saying that they're crazy, or quote unquote, to keep them from getting something they wanted. And sometimes it was a protective order saying, oh, she was out of control, I had to restrain her, when we know that strangulation is one of the most lethal precursors to lethal domestic violence. But usually custody was the main threat. And we know that threats around custody are a powerful source of control for survivors. Next slide, please. So some of the qualitative findings, people talked about their partners calling them, pathologizing names, reading to them out of the DSM and giving them diagnoses, trying to convince other people that they're mentally ill, or blaming the abuse on the partner's mental health and saying, well, I had to do this. She was just really, you know, she's the problem. And then the next one, form of mental health coercion that was really highlighted was treatment, what we call treatment interference. So sometimes they come to appointments with someone, try to influence the healthcare provider or the mental health provider to influence their diagnosis. We heard stories of people coercing a partner to take an overdose of medications and then threatening to have them committed, and calling a suicide hotline and saying that their partner had overdosed. Controlling medications, and there was a continuum of preventing a partner from taking their meds, forcing them to take the wrong dose, taking too much, stealing their meds, calling them an addict for taking meds. You know, it's like a whole range of things. And sometimes it would be one or the other, depending on what their partner was feeling like at the moment. We also heard stories of partners being forced to take too much medication and then being sedated, and their partner maxing out their credit cards and then leaving them, or, you know, just so many, any permutation you could think of. And then again, the threats to discredit, particularly around custody, or make false allegations when someone's seeking a protective order. Next slide, please. So the substance use coercion study was over 3,000 callers. And again, these are not people in substance use disorder treatment. 26% said they'd ever use substances to reduce the pain of partner abuse. And we think about self-medication with substances as a main reason people use. But 27% said they'd been pressured or forced to use or made to use more than they wanted. So just think about that. That's like a quarter of callers who aren't necessarily using substances who said they were coerced into using by a partner. And of the 15% who had tried to get some kind of help for substance use, over 60% said their partners tried to prevent or discourage them from getting help. And I'll talk in more detail about how that played out. 37.5% of their partners threatened to report them to authorities to keep them from getting something they wanted or needed. And again, it was largely in relation to custody, but sometimes it was also involving the criminal justice system and the police. And then interestingly, almost 25% said they were afraid to call the police because their partner either convinced them that they wouldn't be taken seriously because they were high or using, or that they would be arrested. Next slide, please. So some of the qualitative data found that one of the things that we see all the time is that women in general and survivors of domestic violence in particular are often introduced to substances by an intimate partner, who then controls their supply and entraps them in the relationship. And so that ends up leading to people becoming dependent on substances and then escalating their substance use related problems. So that becomes part of a pattern of control. And think about that, if someone becomes dependent on substances that their partner controls, what that does to them in the relationship. And so the coercive tactics range from, again, there was a continuum, you know, from being kind of convincing someone to use, pressuring them to use, really coercing them to being into using because of threats, specific threats around custody or around other kinds of things, or you know, throwing them out of the house or cutting them off from friends or family, or literally forcing them into using and being drugged. And we would hear stories of survivors whose partners force them to use and then videotape them and then show the videotapes to Child Protective Services or to their parole officer or probation officer, or force them to use and then literally calling their parole or probation officer. Next slide, please. So Gwen, as you talked about with treatment interference, people not being allowed to attend meetings or seek treatment or being harassed into leaving. It used to be calling people all the time. Now it might be texting them all the time. Withholding transportation or childcare or financial resources for treatment or shoes. And then, so there's all these ways of preventing someone from accessing treatment, saying, oh, you're having an affair with a substance use counselor or someone in the group, and using that as a way to keep someone from accessing treatment. And then the recovery sabotage, keeping substances in the home or using in front of a person at, when they're in recovery. So anything they can do to undermine their ability to maintain recovery. And then controlling medications or stealing them or using them to coerce and control. We think about that when someone's on MAT, and then escalating the violence if a partner tries to stop using. One of the, anyway, I'm just thinking about some other examples, but when we go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, Carol, I was just going to say too, with regard to that slide, is that, a lot of the women that we worked with, when they went to AA meetings, it was mostly men there. And so that created another kind of barrier or challenge for women to get sober. And it caused a lot of problems for them when they went back home to their partners in terms of being around a lot of men in that in those meetings and socializing afterwards. And so they found that AA was very, very difficult for them to participate in that for a multitude of reasons. And so that kind of limited access to one of the most available sources of help that's out there. So it's there's a lot a lot of things involved in safety and sobriety.
You know what, and I'm glad you brought that up, because another thing that people have talked about is, one, being in programs where it's mostly men, even treatment programs, and that they could be in the same program with their abusive partner or with men who are predators, and it just doesn't feel safe, or talking, actually sharing things that are more personal in those settings doesn't feel safe. A lot of programs are not, if people actually do have any access to substance use treatment programs, that they might not be either culturally responsive or gender responsive or trauma informed or kind of comprehensive, or be two generation where you can bring your children. So there's the kinds of services that might be most responsive to people often are not available. So there are many barriers that people face. So thanks. Next slide. So, and this slide is just to, make us all think about, when we think about the neurobiology of substance use disorder, dependence, and all the neural circuitry that's involved, and what happens with, the circuits involved in relapse triggering, either exposure, if you think about it, exposure to addictive or rewarding drugs, condition cues from the environment that's a reminder of a substance that you were managing to kind of keep at bay, or exposure to stressful experiences. If you think about the experience we just talked about. So thinking about how an abusive partner can deliberately activate those pathways that cause relapse. So it's just linking neurobiology and people's life experiences. Next slide. And then a couple of other things that people talked about, blaming the abuse on a partner's use of substances. So, that, well, you're using, and I had to try to control you because you were using and it was such a problem. And benefiting from the stigma associated with substance use and lack of access to services. So knowing that historically a lot of DV programs wouldn't allow people in if they were using, that's really starting to change. And particularly in tribal programs, people welcome everyone as relatives, but that's been a barrier. But also knowing that there are many other barriers that survivors face. And, I mean, part of why really wanted to be talking with you today is we know in family courts, when we've talked to judges who are DV savvy judges and we talk about substance use and mental health coercion, they'll say, well, if I have to make a decision in a custody case and the person who's the abuser looks really great and the person who he or they've been victimizing doesn't look so well put together, who are we going to give the kids to? Or when we're thinking about dependency court, you know, how do we make decisions? And but that's why we really are thinking about factoring in the role of mental health and substance use coercion in making decisions is so critical. Survivors also talked about substance use related sexual coercion and abusive partners. Women reported that their partners would, you know, pressure them to use as part of their sexual activity or drug them and then sexually assault them. So there's lots of ways that plays out, including introduction into trafficking, human sex trafficking, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then again, the threats to discredit we already talked about. So there are many ways, including false allegations that someone's using when they're not. So, I mean, the courts play such a critical role. And you know, one of the things we found is that abusive partners can actually leverage the stigma associated with mental health and substance use to influence and turn other systems against their partners. Next slide.
And Carol, I
So
just wanted to
Carol,
add to that one too about stigma is a powerful tool. As I'd mentioned earlier, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and that was one of the things that my ex had told her. We lived in a condominium complex, and he had told everybody that I had a drinking problem and that I'd been in a mental institute for a number of years and was unstable. And, you know, I could tell, you know, people that live there across the street when I'm walking down the street or something, but, you know, clearly people that don't know you, you know, that's all they've heard about you. And so it's powerful in alienating you from community, family, and sources of help. So yeah, and Christine, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, it's fine. You just set up this next comment. I just wanted to point out that there was a comment in the chat box from Carol. And her comment is, as a retired tribal prosecutor, I would often see police reports where the abuser forces the victim to drink or use drugs immediately before the physical abuse to as to say, as you say, to discredit the victim or to gain the sympathy of law enforcement officer who will then not take a report from the victim. So everything that you are saying has been seen in tribal court. I just
Thank you.
wanted to point that out. That was a
Thank
really
you.
good comment.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, you know, a dear colleague and friend of mine who we started a hospital-based advocacy project way back in the 90s, and her experience was that she had left after her partner had, you know, been very physically violent at a certain point in time, and it had been so severe that she decided to leave. And he convinced her to come back, and then he did it again. And when the police came, they were going to walk him around the block, and she got really upset, and they took her to a psych unit because she was so upset. So, you know, there's so many ways this can play out. Next slide.
Christina, but before we go on, I saw a hand raised too. Can you see that? I don't know if they have a question or.
Yeah, so actually one is more of a little bit of a technical question. Is there any way that we can see the questions from others, please? And so we have two functions. We have the question and answer function, and then we also have the chat box. The chat box is more readily visible from everybody within our session, so that you can see that. So if you ask a question, we encourage you to put it in the chat box, okay? And let me check the hand raised. Let me see.
Now there's two.
Okay. Now there's one. Let's see. And if you have your hand raised, go ahead and write your comment or your question in the chat box and we'll get to it.
Thank you, Christina.
You're welcome.
Next slide. And we have a bunch of questions for you at the end, so we want to make sure we get to them. I might start talking faster, and if it's too fast, let me know. We use this slide to just make the point that, as you said, Gwen, that one of the things that people who abuse their partners do is they try to actively undermine their partner's relationships with their children in a variety of ways. And yet, research consistently shows that it's the attachment to the non-offending parent or non-abusive caregiver that's what's most protective of children's resilience and development. And so, for many reasons, including that threats related to loss of custody and child removal are such a prominent form of abuse, particularly in the context of mental health and substance use coercion, it's really important to hold that, supporting that attachment, even though an abusive partner is really actively trying to undermine it and making decisions. The other issue that comes up in, I'm sure you're familiar in 23 states plus DC, substance use during pregnancy is considered child abuse and is grounds for removal, and including MAT, medication-assisted treatment. So if a partner coerces a partner to use and they're going to get drug tested, they're likely to lose their kids. Even though, all the major mental health, American Academy of Pediatrics and OBGYN recommend MAT and that, when you maintain that child-parent bond, neonatal abstinence syndrome is much shorter and the kids do better and the mothers do better. So I just thinking about how those policies play out in other settings and what that means for any kinds of decisions that you're making. Next slide, please. I wanted to just highlight a couple of things about the implications for the opioid epidemic. And I know opioids are a major issue in tribal communities, and methamphetamines are as well. But we know that we have data on intimate partner violence and opioid use and know that IPV really increases the risk for opioid use. 90% of women accessing services, and this is one study in New York, a methadone clinic had experienced intimate partner violence, Louisa Gilbert's work. But there's also some new data that Dr. Gilbert's collected that hasn't been published yet, said that women who, in her study, had been formerly incarcerated, I believe, or on probation, were 6 times more likely to overdose on opioids if they were experiencing intimate partner violence. So again, thinking about those intersections. Next slide. So when you think about opioids in the context of intimate partner violence, so if someone's introduced to opioids and then they become dependent and their partner controls their supply, then they can threaten them with withdrawal as another tactic of control. We've even heard of abusive partners using Narcan on their partners as a warning that, I can put you into withdrawal, and then using that to coerce their partner to engage in illegal activities, whether it's either sex for drugs just to support his supply, or to bring in income, or as a route into sex trafficking, or stealing to support their supply or his drug use, or dealing. So all of those things, once someone is on the other side of the looking glass and is involved with the criminal justice system, that actually creates many more barriers for them, as you're well aware, and including around access to certain kinds of benefits and impacting their economic stability. So there's lots of ways that can play out. We've heard of people who abuse their partners physically injuring them so they can go to the emergency room and obtain opioids. And then the ER docs becoming frustrated and refusing to treat them rather than figuring out what's going on and offering support and services. So there's lots of ways that this plays out. Also, when people are seeking, if someone is accessing treatment or medication-assisted treatment, particularly methadone, where you have to go at specific times, it's much easier to have a partner stalk you because they know where you're going and when, or that keeping someone from meeting their treatment requirements, and then they get exited from treatment because they're missing appointments, or they're testing positive, or they're more than 15 minutes late too many times. So just thinking about when people have treatment plans that they can't actually adhere to because of the abuse. Next slide. Next slide, I think it's reverse order. Yeah, and so this is just a slide on the, there's a lot of research on women and opioid use, and that those risks are amplified in the context of intimate partner violence. So women, when the opioid epidemic was kind of escalating, that women were more likely to be overprescribed opioids. Women have higher rates of interpersonal abuse and violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, childhood sexual abuse, plus depression, PTSD, and painful medical conditions, often from the abuse. So they're more likely to be prescribed opioids for chronic pain, both physical pain and emotional pain, given higher doses, and to use it for a longer time. Now, some of that's changed since people have become more aware, but people did become physiologically dependent because of that overprescribing. That women were at greater risk for non-medically prescribed use to self-medicate for emotional distress, and more likely to be initiated into hazardous use by an intimate partner, which we talked about already. And they're also at increased risk for opioid overdose because of the phenomenon of telescoping, which you may be familiar with, which is that it takes a shorter time to become physiologically dependent, just physiological differences that women experience, and more likely to develop medical complications at earlier. And then the barriers to care, including stigma, of seeking treatment, the risk if you go to treatment, then someone could use, an abusive partner could use that against you in court, and lack of access to childcare. And there's also this opioid-related suicide. I'm on the Maternal Mortality Review Committee in Illinois, and we have a separate violent deaths committee, which is homicide, suicide, and overdose. And when we look at the coroner's reports, no one's linking those three to see what the connections are. And then the barriers I just talked about at a policy level around pregnancy and neonatal abstinence syndrome that are often used in punitive ways against women who are struggling with opioid use. Next slide. So this is just a way to look at how all of these issues intersect. So the opioid overprescribing and self-medication and being coerced into using. So it's like things that you normally think about and then adding in the layer of coercion. Or if you're at greater risk, a shorter time to becoming physiologically dependent, what role does coercion play there? Lack of access to comprehensive kinds of treatment and culturally responsive approaches, and then how access to treatment gets sabotaged. So it's like thinking about, the risk of sexual coercion and human trafficking, or being involved in the criminal justice or system or child protective service system involvement. So all the things that coercion can do to jeopardize the safety and well-being of survivors and their children. Next slide. So I think this is yours, Gwen.
Sure. Yeah. So I know I kind of probably jumped it earlier when I was talking about stigma, but
Hey, we could.
experiencing a mental health or substance use disorder places individuals at a greater risk of for being controlled by an abusive partner. And stigma is, as I mentioned earlier, is really huge, and it's something that really takes a lot of work across communities and disciplines and everything else to address stigma and how damaging that can be on victim survivors of domestic violence. It just, all it says to a victim survivor is that I don't stand a chance, really, when they're trying to get out of the situations that they're in. And there's so many systems that come into play in working with victim survivors of domestic violence, and to be able to have that kind of influence across all of those is clearly a task for DV advocates and tribal advocates doing this work. Next slide, please. And this chart here, it just shows the prevalence of parental substance use as a contributing factor for removal. And as you can see in the US, just in that 16-year period, how it's gone up almost a percentage point every single year, and it just continues to climb. And some of the reasons for removing children from their families, when you look at like child trends or some of those where they pull all the data from the states on children in foster care. But the reasons for removal are neglect, inadequate housing. Oh, I just want to say that neglect can be a number of things, and it's defined pretty loosely so that, you know, oftentimes neglect is the number one reason for child removal. And it's by it being ill-defined, we see a lot of kids that are removed for that reason. Inadequate housing is kind of a second, one of the second highest reasons for removing children. And then parental substance use is like the third highest when we look at child removal. And other areas are physical abuse, sexual abuse, abandonment, parental incarceration, inability to cope, and child behavioral problems. And so I think it's just, you know, it's important to know how critical substance use by a parent is in contributing to this removal. Next slide, please. I think this goes back to you.
Yeah, so just thinking about drug courts, and you know where it's often more criminal legal system focused, and thinking about how the criminalization of substance use and arrest or incarceration for substance use related crimes, so that, you know, where people can't seek help because they're afraid of being arrested, so, or losing their kids, or how the substance use related, you know, we know that for women who are incarcerated, it's usually substance use related crimes. And so just thinking about the role of intimate partner, I mean, we don't think substance use should be criminalized in the first place, but the role of intimate partner violence and substance use coercion. People would talk about in some of our qualitative interviews that they would be literally left holding the bag, you know, or where their, you know, their partner would leave and the police would come and they would be the ones who had the, you know, paraphernalia drugs around, or their partner would convince them that they should take the rap because their sentence wouldn't be, they would have the lesser sentence. So it's just thinking about all of those factors and making decisions. Next slide. And this is just a way of kind of looking at it all together. You know, people experience the traumatic effects of abuse, and then active undermining sanity and sobriety, sabotaging treatment, and then using all of those things against survivors when they try to get help, or with the systems that come into their lives, and the role of stigma and the ability of an abusive partner to leverage the stigma and those systems against their partner. Next slide. Just wanted to highlight that during COVID, we know that intimate partner violence increased because people were trapped at home with abusive partners, and that we think that coercion around mental health and substance use increased as well. That's what we've been hearing. So that just thinking about the role of intimate partner violence and coercion in adding to layers of all of the anxiety, the grief, fear, and loss that people are experiencing, and what role that plays. And the other piece is around telehealth specific barriers. I know many people don't have access to any kind of telehealth technology, although they're trying to change that now. There's new money going out to try to support more broadband access. But if you're in a situation where someone does have access to telehealth services, if there's an abusive partner in the home, it's probably not safe. They're probably listening in. They may put spyware on the person's computer, that some of the loosening of HIPAA privacy regulations actually might be helpful in some circumstances, but may work against a survivor whose partner is trying to access their information. So just things to keep in mind if they come up. Next slide. That's you.
So yeah, so we've been saying all this just to you know, drive home the importance of partnering with domestic violence services. And we know there's not a tribal domestic violence shelter in every community, but I would think in most communities there is some type of domestic violence program, either with the tribe or as a tribal nonprofit or another nonprofit agency that works with victim survivors of domestic violence. And you know, it's just so important that conversations such as these and about victim survivors and their experiences are part of our work, part of everyone's work. And we know that, you know, it really takes a whole community to respond to domestic violence. There's domestic violence is in every community, and we really need to have the services available to victim survivors. But even more important than that is that we partner with all our other tribal agencies, law enforcement, courts, social services, child welfare, housing, healthcare, behavioral healthcare. And the list just goes on. And it's just so important that all of these agencies and organizations have an understanding of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and organize how we work together so that we're not creating additional challenges and barriers for victim survivors as they have to, you know, go through all these various systems and agencies. Next slide, please. And so we kind of use this little chart here to again, kind of sum up a lot of the things that we've talked about in terms of mental health and substance use coercion. Here we have a survivor may be unable to comply with treatment requirements, have difficulty keeping appointments. And I know we've focused a lot on mental health and substance use, and we haven't really talked that much about trauma and trauma's role in all of this and seeking help and, you know, getting well, getting healthy, and getting out of a violent relationship. Having difficulty keeping appointments and face barriers due to stigma and inflexible expectations, relapse due to stress, trauma, threats, and coercion. Be reluctant to seek assistance or contact police for fear of being arrested or having your kids removed or finding yourself in a worse situation than you were before. Being coerced into engaging in illegal activities. And we know that, you know, substance use and mental health coercion are used a lot in sex trafficking, and you know, as a way to further bring people into that business. An abuser may try to manipulate your perceptions and make false allegations, and it's really hard when someone lies about you. It's just one of those things that you can't walk back. You know, you just have to deal with. And for victim survivors, you know, when things have said, false allegations have been made about them to their families, to their children, to their friends, to their community members, and their where the places where they work and so forth, very, very damaging, because it always leaves something in someone's mind. Preventing your partner from participating in treatment, deliberately sabotaging recovery efforts. And we talked about this one quite a bit. Coercing a partner to use so they'll screen positive. You know, that can mean losing a job. That could mean losing work in your profession. You know, if you're a nurse or a healthcare provider or something like that, you know, chances are you'll have a hard time being able to work back in your profession again. Using mental health and substance use to undermine partners' credibility, obtain a protection order or access clinical records. You know, getting a protection order. A lot of times people are afraid to get those because of all, you know, that goes into getting one. Coerce partners to use or over-medicate, then videotape or put them into withdrawal, causing them to miss appointments. And the other thing, I think Carol had talked earlier about the sexual violence under the influence, and oftentimes videotaping those. Those are powerful coercive tools. Coercing a partner into committing a crime and calling law enforcement or probation or parole officer. So just making you look really, really bad in this relationship.
I think, you know, I just wanted to add that, you know, part of how we were thinking about this was like, you may see a survivor not complying with whatever requirements, and then to be thinking about all the things that the abusive partner may be doing that makes it impossible for them to do that. So, you know, just thinking in the context where you are making decisions. So.
Next slide, please. And then here's some concepts that, you know, would be a really good idea to incorporate into your assessments. Just asking those questions, just digging a little deeper and going a little bit more into your questioning when it comes to domestic violence, substance use, and mental health. Has your partner deliberately done things to make you feel like you're going crazy or losing your mind? I don't think anyone ever asked me that. Has your partner ever forced you to use substances, take an overdose, or kept you from routines that are healthy for you? And we've seen a lot of, we worked with a lot of women who weren't able to work out. In fact, we saw that a lot of violence and, you know, erupted because they wanted to go to the gym. They wanted to be healthy, and that was sabotaged. Has your partner ever tried to control your medication or prevent you from accessing treatment? Have they deliberately done things to sabotage your recovery? And you can think about your own way of how you would like to reword some of this, but you know, I think these questions would be an important part of any assessment. Has your partner blamed you for their abusive behavior by saying you're the one who's crazy or an addict? Has your partner used a substance use or mental health condition as a way to discredit you with other people? I mean, clearly there are people with mental health issues, and they shouldn't be used as a way to discredit you or to cause problems where you work or with your family. Has your partner threatened to take your children away because you're receiving substance use or mental health treatment? Has your partner ever coerced you into doing things you didn't want to do by threatening to put you into withdrawal? I think these are all really good questions and concepts. We'll go to the next slide with Carol.
Yeah. So another thing, these are from a toolkit we developed on responding to mental health and substance use coercion in the context of, you know, primary care and behavioral health treatment settings. And so thinking about if you're making assessments for services, also asking about the relationship of person's feelings and symptoms to the abuse or previous trauma to contextualize them, and to mental health or substance use coercion. And also thinking about, you know, when you're making treatment plans, or to think about, excuse me, how their partner responds when they're using or symptomatic. So for example, is their partner only nice to them when they're really depressed or when they're using? Is their partner only nice to them when they're not using or when they're feeling fine? You're trying to think about how this plays into someone's use of substances or their mental health symptoms, and also how they might respond to treatment or medication. Like, do you have to develop safety plans around where you can keep medication someplace else so they can't control it, or how to access appointments in safe ways, or times, or flexibility. So there's lots of things in the toolkit about how to kind of strategize with a survivor about what's going to actually work for them, and having backup kinds of plans. Next slide. And this was, I think, in response, it kind of addresses one of the questions that comments someone made, is thinking about if someone's using substances, whether as a parent or during pregnancy, is it actually creating harm for the kids or not? And if it's not, there are ways to safety plan around using substances that you can do safely, even if you're not able to stop or choose not to stop using them. And what kinds of services can you put in place? Or how can someone make sure that their child is with someone who's safe if they're using? So it's thinking about how to incorporate this into whatever kinds of plans you develop, and also what kinds of wraparound services you can provide to support survivors, both around safety and around substance use and mental health. And the other thing, you know, just to reiterate that, to making sure that the person who's the abuser is not controlling your perceptions about their partner. And one of the things we've thought about, you know, someone, you know, I think about this in a custody situation. If someone, I think people in my own practice who had a mother who had a severe mental health condition and was suicidal, that, you know, if the other partner isn't abusive, they'll like wrap around the kids, support the, their mother, make sure everyone is taken care of rather than using that against them. So we want you to think of that as a red flag if it's brought up in a custody case or any other kind of case that you're seeing. Next slide. So these are the questions that we had for you. You may have questions for us, but we wanted to at least have you be thinking about and sharing with us, because we're really interested in how this is landing for you, what you're seeing, what you think about what we've just shared, how you might use it. Gwen, do you want to say more about some of the questions?
No, I think given our limited time, I know we have some other questions following this that we were looking for feedback from or response from our participants. So if we wanted to go to some of those, I know Christina was going to facilitate the questions for us, because I think this is our last slide, right, Carol?
I think there's some more, see if there's another, I think there's some more questions. Yeah.
The questions, yeah. So we have the first question, and okay, go ahead, Kristen.
So just to let our audience know that you can utilize the chat box and answer these questions in the chat box. So the first question is, what can tribal courts do to support the safety and recovery of survivors of intimate partner violence? And just from my own experience as a clinician and as a former probation officer, I really like those practical assessment questions that you gave, Carol and Gwendolyn, because I can so see those being put in a Healing to Wellness Court application or an assessment. Just those basic questions that we all need to ask as Healing to Wellness Court professionals.
Thanks, Christina. I think we have a set of resources that are separate that have links to a page on our website on substance use coercion and the toolkits there. And we have a palm card on substance use coercion. So there's lots of resources that you could use and adapt, in ways that make sense for you, both on mental health and substance use coercion. So.
And I love that segue, Carol, because it lets us tell the group about our resource center. So the resources that Carol and Gwendolyn are talking about are in our resource room on our virtual Six Connect space. So if you go to that space, you can find all the resources that have contributed to their presentation.
It looks like we might have time for one more question, one or two more questions, Christina.
Go ahead, Marley, next. Okay. So what are some of the barriers related to accessing treatment for people in your community? And we can talk in relation to pre-COVID or COVID times, because we know the barriers in COVID time. Programs are unfortunately maybe not doing in person, but also just what are some of the barriers of just individuals being able to access services? We have a comment from Kit on the previous question. And she writes, I'm going to suggest to our team that we ask those simple assessment questions and then re-ask and re-ask and re-ask as participants progress through the program phases. And I really like how you brought that in relation to drug courts. So we as drug court practitioners, we may see an individual stall at a phase and maybe say, oh, there's something going on. But I like Kit's approach and saying, we need to ask, we need to re-ask, why is this person who was doing really well in maybe their first phase, now they're advancing into the second phase or third phase, and they're not doing so well? We would call it a stall, but we need to ask why. Why is this person maybe suddenly testing positive for marijuana? Or why have all of a sudden they stopped going to their groups or their treatment appointments? So once again, asking why are these things happening, and not just thinking that they're being resistant to the process. Maybe there is something else going on. I really like how you broke that down, Carol, into how it applies to us as drug court programs.
You know, I'm thinking about, there was a study in Vermont, and one person talked about how her partner pressured her to smoke marijuana so she'd calm down because she was mad about him beating her. You know, so you just don't know. There's so many permutations. And, you know, one of the things I want to say before we end, because I want to keep talking, is that if anyone wants to keep talking to us, we really want to learn from you what would make a difference and what would be helpful, so that we can kind of support that or fold that in or create some more guidance that's really relevant. So just, our contact information is at the end or in the beginning. It's on your slides. We just would love to hear from you if you're thinking about this and want to be, you know, have creative ideas or already doing things that are addressing these issues.
So some of the comments that we're getting right now as barriers are transportation, lack of confidence in self, or feelings of embarrassment or shame. We also have some of the barriers to treatment programs are those treatment programs that require some form of an ID, like an ID card, a social security card, which we know in some intimate partner violence relationships, the aggressor or the main person, the keeps those things, keeps those personal documents. Or they may keep those documents of the children if there's children involved. And so we, you know, those individuals, they can't access them. So if they can't access them, then they can't, you know, access some services. So those are maybe those things as for us as Healing to Wellness Court practitioners that we maybe want to ask. Do you have a social security card? Or maybe we can help facilitate that. Let's go to the social security department and get you a card, and I'll keep it here. I'll keep it for you in your probation file or your Healing to Wellness Court file, so you have one. Okay. So, you know, thinking of those, thinking outside of our box.
Do we have time for another question?
I think we have one more minute, Gwendolyn.
Okay.
Marlon, if you want to bring up the next question. How familiar do you think the people who work in your tribal court are with the concepts of mental health and substance use coercion? I really like that question because in Healing to Wellness Courts, we are very much about cross training. We are very much about learning of all of the other disciplines of those of our team members. So I can totally see this as an in-service for a Healing to Wellness Court team of let's talk about this. Let's bring this out on the table. And I bet you once it gets out on that table, there will be team members who will remember a Healing to Wellness Court participant that was just having these issues. They weren't progressing in the phases. They stopped going to treatment. They weren't making their call-ins, things like that. So I bet you once you put it out on the table, you'll start to realize that there are some issues going on.
Maybe one more.
Okay.
Next question. What are the ways that mental health and substance use coercion come up in your tribal court? And we had that previous comment from a retired prosecutor that said as she read the criminal complaints, she noticed that the victim would say that they were given alcohol or made to use before the violent event happened so as to discredit that victim. And you all have given so many examples of how this often happens. So we have a comment, Carol, once again. Not only are court personnel unfamiliar, but the mental health clinicians and other justice system personnel are unfamiliar as well. So I see a training across all of this discipline. You know, as we have talked about in when I do training and technical assistance, we often talk about trauma-informed courts. Well, I also think we need to, you know, put this on our agenda as well as one of those information pieces that we need to know.
Yeah, we think of it as DV and trauma informed.
Right,
So,
right.
or IPV and trauma informed.
So Carol and Gwendolyn, we are at 32 after the hour. So once again, here's their contact information. If you want to continue to carry on the conversation with them, please do. And don't forget to go to our resource center on our bigger 6Connect page and access their resources. Next slide, Marlon. So this time we'd like to say thank you. Thank you for attending today's Family Track presentation entitled Substance Use Coercion in the Context of Intimate Partner Violence, Implications for Tribal Courts. Recordings will be posted on this platform and will remain until July 30th. After this time, you may find recordings at enhancementtraining.org. If you please check your chat box, Marlon has posted or dropped our link to our evaluation, which is a SurveyMonkey link. We would greatly appreciate it if you gave us your feedback. This helps us to build next year's workshops and also to provide some feedback to our presenters. So once again, we thank you. And if you like this presentation, we have another presentation in the family track tomorrow. So please join us and enjoy your day. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Gwendolyn, for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for having us.